Welcome everybody, welcome back for those who've joined us already yesterday or today, this morning, or for the keynote lecture to this conference. My name is Sarah Meyer and I'm very happy that I can chair this last session of what from my point of view really has been a very interesting conference so far. We've heard about the role of regions in EU constitution making in the first session yesterday, and looking backwards to past EU treaty reforms, but also having discussions on more recent phenomena or developments like the Conference on the Future of Europe. And we had very interesting discussions also in the second session on a specific type of regional actor, namely regional parliaments, or specific type of actor or institution, of course. And we will now broaden our focus also towards the level of individual citizens by addressing the issue of identity, of regional identity, of various identities, which leads me to the title of this third session of the conference, Bringing Citizens in, Regions and Identity in EU Governance. And in this session, we have both academic perspectives on regions and identity on the one hand, and we also have a civil society perspective on the actual mobilization of citizens at regional and local level. And we also very much look forward to this combination of different perspectives. And since we want all of you, the participants of the conference, also to be able to take part or to come in, I would like to repeat the rules of how you can do that, that we have established already in the previous sessions. First of all, after the presentations and the discussion, you can raise your questions or remarks via the chat, or you can later on after the presentations and the discussion, the input by the discussant can raise your hand and show that you would like to raise a question. And we will then take up these questions also from the chat. So I would really like to urge you to use the chat function also during the presentation so that we also know how many questions we will have and can have a better time management. And of course, you can also take part in another aspect of this conference that is also closely related to the topic of this session. You may also want to participate in the dialogical art project Outer Space Transmitter developed by Mona Schulzek that was already introduced previously, who will send your messages to outer space, messages where you can all provide your personal thoughts or answers to the question, what does it mean to be a citizen of the EU? And this also very well fits the topic related to identity and citizens. But now let me introduce our speakers, of course, to the session and also all our discussant, and then listen to our very promising inputs. First of all, I will present that in the order that we also have in the conference program, and I would suggest that we also hear your presentations then in this order before we turn to the discussant and then before we open up the debate, as Gabriele already mentioned before. First of all, Anna Brigevik, Associate Professor at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim. Anna is a political scientist with a research focus on public opinion towards European integration, on the impact of social identities and on party politics. And today she will present a paper on regional identity and support for European integration. Welcome to you. Second, we have Emma Katharina David from the Otto Gürke University Magdeburg. Her focus today will be on multilingual regions with a paper entitled Multilingual Regions, Development Prospects in the EU Multi-Level System. Also, warm welcome to you. Third, we have Kees Terlo, Assistant Professor at the Faculty of Geoscience at Utrecht University. His research focuses, among other things, on the political use of identity discourses of spatial communities. And today he will present a paper on the many faces of regional identities in and on Europe. Welcome to you. And finally, Stephanie Hatton. She's one of the founders of Pulse of Europe, an independent citizens movement mobilizing for a united and democratic Europe, and she will present today regional and local experiences on how to mobilize citizens. Welcome to all of you, to our speakers. to the session, and we will soon hear your presentations. But let me also at this stage already introduce our discussant, Katrin Böttger. Dr. Katrin Böttger is director at the IEP, the Institute for European Politics in Berlin. Her fields of expertise not only include EU external relations, but also issues of, so to say, EU citizens relations, including the European Citizens Initiative, or challenges of Euroscepticism, etc. And thank you very much for discussing these sessions, papers, and presentations today. We are also very happy to have you here. So, and this is already also, everything from my side for the beginning. As Gabriele mentioned, all of our speakers have 15 minutes maximum for their presentations in order for us to have some time later on also for the discussion. And then Katharina will have also 10 to 15 minutes for her commenting on the various papers and presentations. So I would suggest that we start with the first presentation and the first paper by Professor Anna Briggevik, and the floor is yours, and I'm happy to listen to your input.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I think everyone can hear me and see me. Yeah, okay, always good to check. Okay, and thank you for the conference organizers for having me here. It's been really interesting to listen to the presentations on regional elites and institutions. As you will see, I'm a public opinion person, so it's really fun to see how the other half lives. So here we go, public opinion and European integration. So broadly speaking, I'm going to be looking at regional identity in Europe. And in the draft of the paper that I have here, I focus on two types of identities. So on the one hand, I look at an individual level regional identity, and that's typically measured by questions of, how strongly someone feels attached to their regional level. Turns out that that's not the super interesting part of this paper, so I'm going to focus on the part that I think is the most novel and new, and that is looking at how an economic identity or kind of an objective identity of the region can impact support for integration. So we know that one of the challenges of studying regions in Europe is that they are so diverse, and they're diverse on many different dimensions. So you have regions with a long history of, minority nationalism. You have linguistically distinct regions. You have regions that have variation in terms of their autonomy and their relationship to the center. But I think economic distinctiveness has not been really the focus of regional analyses. And so that's kind of the task that I set for myself here. And I've been kicking this idea around for 10 years, so I'm really happy to hear any kind of feedback whatsoever. We know that regions in Europe differ in terms of their economic capabilities. So on the one hand, we have wealthier regions. These are ones that I'm going to be calling as the overachievers. And then you also have poorer regions, and not a great name, but I call them the laggards in this paper. And so I kind of developed some hypotheses for how that kind of regional identity, this economic distinctiveness, could impact support for the EU. And specifically, I'm also interested in this concept of parochialism. And parochialism is a fuzzy term. I don't think it's very frequently used in political science these days. I think the last time I've really seen it kind of elaborated upon is in like Englehart's 1970 book on post-material values. So this is kind of my attempt to bring parochialism into the discussion. And so here, parochialism, as it applies to regionalism, is this idea that a parochial worldview perceives the region as a place of like culture and a traditional way of life. So this is, we know that parochialists tend to be more conservative, both ideologically and in terms of their traditional values. They tend to be older, less mobile, have less education, and all of these things kind of translate into greater Euroscepticism. We kind of see that parochialists tend to preference more traditional mechanisms of addressing political concerns. So they might focus on local level institutions or national level institutions, but they will then sort of kind of not really accept the idea of EU institutions imposing their will upon the region. And so presumably, if we're going to see parochialists anywhere in Europe, we're going to see them in the more underdeveloped regions. But we might not see parochialism at all, right? Because in the 1998 book by Michael Keating, where he looks at new regionalism in Europe, he makes a pretty, I think, successful argument that European regions have really modernized since the 1960s, especially with this idea of Europe of the regions, that the EU has, I think in some ways, maybe like pushed regions along to be more modern and more political and more cosmopolitan actors. Of course, that's something that's still being debated. But so this is why I think it bears investigating whether parochialism is still in play in Europe. So a couple of basic assumptions before I get to the hypotheses and the analyses of this paper. So we know that regional identity is a territorial identity, and it is also a lower order identity. And we know from social identity theory that lower order identities tend to be more exclusionary. There tend to be sharper boundaries drawn between the in-group and these broader out-groups that exist in the world today. And we've also seen from research on regional public opinion that people with these lower order identities tend to be less supportive of the European Union. They tend to not really want to confer legitimacy upon higher order institutions like the EU. And so territorial identity is incredibly consequential for EU studies and for the future of Europe. We also know that people with lower order identities are more reluctant to share resources with outgroups, and specifically people, for example, immigrants, or maybe even people from other European countries. Now, the other assumption that I start off with here is that, the EU has had 2 decades of crises, right? And so at some point, these crises might have highlighted the scarcity of resources in Europe and in the EU. And so specifically with the migrant crisis and the influx of refugees, for some people, immigration might really be a problem over problem of resource sharing. And so the basic assumption here is that anti-EU attitudes should be more acutely felt in regions defined by parochialism, who have these very sharp boundaries between in-groups and out-groups. And from here, we see my 2 research questions. How does economic distinctiveness impact support for the EU? And are underdeveloped regions, these regional laggards, more likely to exhibit parochial tendencies? So how does regionalism relate to parochialism? Well, a number of studies have shown that strong regional attachments depress support for the European Union. Part of this is rooted in this dynamic that I just described about in-group, out-group, conflict and these narrow boundaries. And also some research has shown that lower order identities, regional and local identities, are indicative of this parochial mentality. Now, the definition I kind of start with here in this paper for parochialism is actually an economics definition, but it's the refusal to cooperate or trade with outsiders, as this lowers the returns to groups and to group networks. So this is a paper about kind of sharing resources. And so we know that the integration has created both winners and losers, right? So for some people, integration can be viewed as this really positive process that opens up the region to other kind of possibilities outside of the nation state. But for other people, presumably these more parochial people, they might view this the open borders of the EU as a threat, because on the one hand, it provides for the influx for outsiders into their regional space. And then these people, these outsiders, are then probably going to be competing for the same job as the region's natives. And it also could potentially create a situation where you have flight of capital from the region to other places that are more cosmopolitan, more urban. And so it's quite possible that, parochialism is in play here at the regional level. Also, there is an assumption that for people who are parochialists, they're very concerned with preserving their local culture, right? This is the region as a traditional way of life. For some parochialists and for regionalists in general, the EU might be seen as a threat because it threatens the cultural homogeneity of the region. So you're going to see anti-EU attitudes as a result of this. And this should be kind of couched in ethnocentric terms. So if you are more suspicious of outsiders, immigrants, people of a different race, people of a different religion, then you are going to sort of blame the EU for letting these people in to your region. And for other people, additionally, it could be the case that they process the EU as a place that really distills or dilutes their national voice. There are so many different regions and countries in the EU that their voice might count less in this kind of all-encompassing framework. And so they are going to react negatively to European integration. So the bottom line here is that for some regionalists, there's this goal of protecting their parochial networks from EU encroachment. Now let's take a look at economic distinctiveness. Okay, so a lot of the very hopeful literature from the 90s in the early 2000s on a Europe of the regions has really highlighted that regionalists should be more supportive of integration, right? Because the benefits they receive outweigh the costs. But we also know that not all regions are equipped equally to compete in this highly globalized environment. So we do get winners and losers. And I think in the 90s, there was a positive story to tell here, which is that, well, no, economic distinctiveness is going to lead to more support for the EU. Because on the one hand, the wealthier regions, the overachievers, are going to be really happy about the benefits they get from open and competitive markets. But then at the same time, the poorer regions, the laggards, are going to be benefiting from structural and cohesion funds. And so they're going to translate like goodwill to the EU. I don't think that actually ever happened, sadly. So conversely, I argue that economic distinctiveness is going to result in less support for the EU. Now, on the side of the overachievers, I think that their attitudes towards the EU are going to be defined by welfare chauvinism, right? This idea that, you know, we are wealthy, we are well-to-do, we have good kind of welfare systems in place. So we are going to be less reluctant to share this good stuff that we have with outsiders. And then on the flip side, in terms of the underachievers or the laggers, what I expect to see in play is a sense of protectionism. You know, we have limited resources. We want to keep these limited resources to ourselves because we really need them. And this is going to be tied in together with parochialism. And so kind of to give some context of why I think that this might be in play, this argument too, I mean, if we look at the wealthier northern regions of Italy, these are perfect examples of regions that have kind of this welfare chauvinistic attitude. The Lega Nord, now La Lega, basically traffics in this bundle of welfare chauvinism, hostility towards the South, xenophobia, and Euroscepticism, right? So there's this fear that like regionalism might be going in this direction in some cases. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you know, what we've learned from Brexit, I think, is that like, it doesn't matter how many cohesion funds your region gets, like that doesn't seem to really help build EU support. In the context of Brexit, we know that the counties that overwhelmingly voted to leave were the highest recipients of EU cohesion funds, irony of all ironies. And so this is, you know, I stake my claim that I think argument 2 is more likely to happen. So if I combine this with economic distinctiveness and with parochialism, I expect to see that parochialism will be more apparent in the underdeveloped regions. You're going to have less support for the EU, and the support for the EU is going to be mediated by ethnocentrism, so just a general fear of outsiders, and by concerns over immigrants taking jobs more than anything. And then on the side of the overachievers, I think that they're probably going to have more support for the EU than the laggards. But here, I think you will see concern over immigrants coming in and burdening the welfare state as it exists. And that's going to translate into negative attitudes about the EU, because the EU in this model kind of facilitates these dynamics taking place. Okay, so how do I measure economic distinctiveness? So there's 2 different ways that I attack it here. So first I have, and I guess I should have said this is a quantitative analysis, but I'm going to try to make it as painless as possible for everyone who is not a quantitative analysis person. But so on the one hand, so I have the full model of all the EU countries and regions. And here I operationalize economic distinctiveness as a continuous measure. I don't want to create any arbitrary boundaries just yet between what's considered an overachiever and what's considered a laggard. And so I use a modified measure developed by Fitjar, which he calls the Unevenness Index. So basically I look at, okay, what's the GDP per capita of one region in a country, and how does that compare to the national GDP per capita overall? And so this is This is basically on a scale where the farther away you move from one, the more wealthy the region is vis-a-vis the other regions in the country. And so the more economically distinct overachiever they are. And as you move away from one in the negative direction, so if you're less than one, that means that you are a regional laggard. And so, okay, that's the continuous measure. But then I also want to kind of like unpack the full model and take out the laggards and take out the overachievers and see how these variables perform specifically in these regions. And so here I have to make a decision about how I categorize something as a laggard or an overachiever. And so I do this by looking at, so laggards are regions that have a GDP per capita that is in the bottom quartile of a specific country. So in this analysis, you're going to have laggards from every country that is an EU member. And then overachievers are regions that have a GDP per capita that is in the top quartile of every country, of country X. And so what you get here is in the analysis, there's roughly the same amount of regions in both categories, in the laggards and in the overachievers, but you can see here that the number of respondents is significantly lower in the laggards. And that's because they are these more kind of on the periphery, more economically underdeveloped, less populated, presumably more rural and traditional regions. And you'll see that in the overachievers category, this includes mostly the capital regions of Europe. So we already know that you're going to have more cosmopolitan people living in these areas. And so the drive for ethnocentrism should probably be a little bit lower. Now, I also think it's interesting to point out that not all capital regions are included as overachievers. So in Germany, for example, Berlin is not in the topmost tier of economic regions, and the same goes for the Lazio region in Italy. Okay, but overall, 13 capital regions out of 40 in the overachiever category. Okay, so what I do here is I run a multi-level model using European values study data, and I'm going to take a moment here to, I guess, vent my spleen about the lack of availability of public opinion data in what we have available to us today. Very few public opinion surveys include comprehensive questions about regions. So what I have here is 16 countries in my analysis and 168 regions at the NUTS 2 level, with the exception of Germany, which is that analysis is done at the NUTS 1 level. My dependent variable is confidence in the EU on a 4-point scale. So that's a proxy for support for integration. I've got my measures of economic distinctiveness. I have a measure for ethnocentrism, which is essentially on a 6-point scale, and then questions about the extent that the respondent feels like that immigration brings in crime, that it takes jobs away from natives, and it compromises the welfare state. And then I also have some general economic left-right questions and a question for specifically to measure exclusive identity, which I won't go in here. Okay, so as someone pointed out earlier, the proof of the pudding is in the eating it. So here are the results from the model. So success, economic distinctiveness does impact support for European integration, and in the way that I predict that this is a curvilinear relationship, that people from regions that are laggards and people from regions that are overachievers tend to have more negative opinions or tend to have less confidence in the EU. And you can see here that the tipping point appears to be that if your regional GDP is per capita is 1.5 times that of the national average, support for the EU starts to decline, which is also kind of, I think, a little bit surprising, because you think the regions that are capitals would really kind of bolster the positivity towards the EU. But does this relate to parochialism? So to explore that further, I look at how some of these variables that I talked about, ethnocentrism and attitudes towards immigration, impact support in these different kinds of regions. And you can see here that ethnocentrism really has the same impact on confidence for the EU in all of the different region types. That we can't, based on this, we can't really say that the economic laggards are being afflicted by ethnocentrism more than other places. And in fact, you can't really get at it in this graph, but there is the line for the overachievers is a little bit more steep. So ethnocentrism actually has a bigger impact on negative EU attitudes in the wealthier regions. And then finally, if we look at how people perceive immigrants and the impact of immigrants on their country, and then how that translates into EU attitudes. So in the full model, we see that, yes, negative attitudes towards immigrants translate into less support for the EU, not surprising. But interestingly, the bigger effect here is in this fear of immigrants taking advantage of the welfare state, and the fear over immigrants taking your jobs tends to have less of an impact. And then when we look at the laggards model, you can see here that there's no statistically significant effect in this fear of immigrants taking jobs and that translating into Euroscepticism. And this once again really kind of punches a hole through my theory that I think, economic laggards are going to be more susceptible to parochial mentality. And what you do end up seeing is that in the overachievers camp, you do see, I think, evidence of welfare chauvinism, because here, more than anywhere else, there is this fear that immigrants are going to come in and take sap our welfare systems, and that then translates into less support for the EU. Okay, so conclusions that I reach at the end of this analysis: exclusive regionalism at the individual level does impact EU support negatively, but this effect is really small, so I don't bother to present it here. We can see that economic distinctiveness does negatively impact EU support at both ends of the spectrum. There's little evidence that laggards are being kind of conditioned by parochial tendencies, and I think the more kind of worrying thing here is that overachievers are engaging in welfare chauvinism. But I think overall, this might be a positive message that parochialism isn't as active in the EU today. And maybe it truly is that the EU has changed kind of the face of these regions over time. And I think to get at that, it would be great if somebody, maybe me, would do a time series analysis that really looks at how the content of regionalism has changed over time. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for this very interesting paper and presentation. And I will immediately hand over to Emma Katharina David on multilingual regions, development prospects in the EU multi-level system.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can see my screen. Okay, I hope you can see my screen, and I hope you can hear me really good. Thank you for this opportunity. I will be presenting to you today a kind of a work in progress and subject of which I've been working on in a bigger picture, namely my PhD thesis. In my PhD thesis, I'm focusing on the policy of multilingualism in the European Union and regions as main actors in this policy. And today's presentation is about multilingual regions, development prospects in the EU multi-level system, which is kind of, let's say, a more conclusion-making, results-taking of my PhD thesis. Yes, I will be introducing to you a bit the topic behind today's presentation, then followed by a short presentation of my methodology, both in my PhD thesis to better understand today's presentation and paper. Then I will continue with two main arguments or challenges which have to be considered when looking at multilingual regions more closely in Europe. And then, of course, we will end the discussion with a few conclusions. Yes, as I said in the beginning, this paper is a part of my PhD thesis, and it all started with the fact that when Romania, from where I come also the country, Romania, when it entered in 2007 in the European Union, the Commissioner for Multilingualism was established, and it was given as a position to the Romanian Commissioner. And this was, in my opinion, a really interesting fact, although it was highly criticized that the position didn't have real competencies, and technically it was set to fail from the beginning, which then turned to be true in 2010 when this position was abolished. And this was a really interesting fact for me because I think it was a missed opportunity. And from this introduction, I took the liberty to, let's say, overthrow the perspective from the top down to the bottom up in the multi-level system. And by shifting this perspective, I I approached the regions and the subnational level to see what opportunities lie in the European integration, both for the European Union in this matter and also for the national states, which, as we have seen also in latest periods, have had a number of challenges dealing with the regions. Therefore, my research question focuses on how member states handle regional and multilingual aspects within their territory, and how can this be incorporated in the multi-level system of the European Union, so to for the regions also to fulfill a proactive role in the EU integration. And in my paper, I represent following hypothesis that in order to understand regional level multilingualism or regional level culture, particular attention must be dedicated to the historical background and the different state system approaches. In this way, we can showcase various experiences in each state and identify solutions on a case-by-case basis while still genuinely appreciating the European diversity. As you already might have heard from my hypothesis, I focus on regional multilingualism in national and European politics, but my focus lies in the historical background and in today's state systems. And for this, I have used the actor-centered institutionalism by Mainz and Scharf, because it identifies, how do I say, relationship patterns in institutional frameworks, so like the European Union, or in more restricted institutional frameworks like the European Commission, the national parliaments, the regional parliaments, etc. And these frameworks are organizational and social structures which not only restrict actor behavior with the set guidelines and rules, but also enable action and also communication beyond private scopes. And I have had a number of case studies. The first three are case studies of my PhD thesis, because my focus lies in bilateral cooperation in my PhD thesis. So I looked at the German-Danish border region. I looked at South Tyrol as a focus point between Italy and Austria, and at Transylvania as a focus point between Romania and Hungary. But for today's paper, I also draw on the experiences of Catalonia and the Basque Country in Spain, and on the experiences of Northern Ireland and Scotland in the UK, which, although they are not anymore as of 2020 members in the European Union, but nonetheless, they are interesting cases to be looked at, especially considering the Brexit debate. This brings us already to my first challenge or argument, namely the historical background. When we regard the historical background of each region and nation state, we can see that they developed along certain historical conflict lines. I name them cleavage lines, and these are mostly surrounding state building in Europe. And the first cleavage line is surrounding the end of the First World War, when at the Peace Conference of Versailles, South Tyrol was given to Italy, Transylvania was given to Romania, and the German-Danish border was kind of established in the sense that the population there had the right to hold a referendum to establish the border. Then we see also another conflict line emerging, which is especially interesting because it's mainly in regions of the former Habsburg Empire. We see the protective power of the kin state emerging, which is also kind of considering the bilateral relations a bit provocative, especially considering Hungary's foreign policy towards Transylvania and towards Romania, but we can see this also emerging in Austria's rhetoric towards South Tyrol. For the other regions which I took for experience, although they have the same development considering, let's say, state building, but because they weren't affected directly by the First World War, they have other cleavage lines to battle, which we can see also in today's rhetoric and regional identity. And these are more or less surrounding the role of the crown in former colonial states, colonial powers in Europe. And for the case of Northern Ireland, we can clearly see the loyalist versus Republican cleavage line, which had its roots in the 17th and 18th century, and it became more acute after the First World War, during also the Troubles in the second half of the 20th century. But also now, after the aftermath of the Brexit debate, which is still going on, we can still see clearly this cleavage line gaining prominence. Also, in the case of Scotland, we have the cleavage line independence versus devolution, or more or less, independence versus versus more administrative powers, because Scotland was united with England in the 18th century, and this was clearly not in conformity with the regional identity of Scotland. And I think it will be interesting to see the results of yesterday's elections, which will also let's say, sustain or not sustain my cleavage line theory about independence versus devolution and the future role of Scotland as a region or as a new state. In the case of Catalonia and the Basque Country, it's also interesting because both of them have had over the history self-government. They were self-government regions, which during the Franco regime were abolished for a short time. And in this time, also in the Basque Country, was the foundation of the ETA, which kind of took the turn of a more violent period. Also after the reinstatement of democracy. So also in both cases, we have today the discussion about autonomy versus independence in Spain. This brings me to my second challenge or argument to be regarded when speaking about regional identities, namely what is today's picture in the European Union. And for this, we can look at the state systems and what kind of regional frameworks they have set. And we can roughly categorize states in federal state systems, which from my case studies are only Germany and Austria, in which case all constituent states have the same competencies written out in the constitution. Usually these exclude foreign policy and military. But in our case, since I'm speaking about cultural or linguistic aspects, the constituent states have the competencies to decide upon these matters. And secondly, we have unitary state systems, which are more prominent in the European Union. And in this case, it also can get a bit more complicated, the debate, because we differ between territorial autonomies and non-territorial autonomies. Territorial autonomies are like the autonomous communities of Spain, the regions in the United Kingdom like Northern Ireland and Scotland, or the regions of Italy. But also between these states, we can have clear, diverse approaches toward autonomies, because, for example, in the case of Spain, all autonomous communities are equally recognized in the constitution. Meanwhile, in Italy, we differ between regions with an ordinary or a normal statute and regions with an special statute, such as the Trentino South Tyrol. Then in the case of non-territorial autonomies, these are collective rights based, so they are without linkage to a certain territory in the state. And this is a special characteristic which remained from the Habsburg Empire, and that's why we can see it more clearly in Eastern Europe, in Hungary and Romania. Yes, this brings us already to the conclusions. I think this has been voiced over the last few days a lot. Also that, and I can just reiterate it also in my case, that democracy and especially the EU integration has played an important role for the regional voices on the European Union. We can see that the regions and regional identities play a more important in debate in the mainstream of the EU debate. Then secondly, the historical cleavage lines play an important role to understand not only identity building, but also to understand today's rhetoric when it comes to regions in the European Union and to understand their position. Also state systems play, on the other hand, an important role to understand also and to highlight the different prospects and the different positions of states. Because as said, we don't have throughout the whole Europe regions or regions with administrative power. So this is also important to keep in mind. And regarding, I wrote here internal affairs, but what I mean, the relation between the subnational level, so the regional level or the local level with the central level, it is of course always important to have a compromising position, which is, as we have seen in the practice of also Catalonia or Northern Ireland and Scotland, not always the case, and it is not always easy to find compromise. But in my opinion, the EU can play in this regards an important role, although it doesn't have the necessary competencies. It still can be a neutral arena to open discussions towards identity building and towards regional conflict solution. And I think it would be an opportunity now with the conference on the future of Europe to further some elements of the regional level policy, such as the European Committee of Regions, which could play a really an important role if it would have the necessary means. And secondly, I think this is also really important because it is in the end the core idea of the whole European integration, namely the peaceful coexistence of its peoples. And it is, I think, achievable mostly also through transnational cooperation opportunities, which are a variety of, in a variety of degree and on variety of levels, as we can see here in this picture. By blurring, if you may like, by blurring the physical borders in the European Union, we can also focus on cooperation and on furthering the European integration. Yes. This was everything from my part. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation and also for really sticking to the time limit perfectly. Thank you so much. Just as a reminder to everyone, you can already post your questions in the chat. I see that there's already one question, and we will collect these questions and then come back to them after we've heard all the presentations and also the comments by our discussant. So we'll have our next presentation now by Kees Tjarlo, who will present his paper on the many faces of regional identities, and the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. I hope everybody hears me and sees me standing here and see what's written on my wall, hopefully. Perhaps you must, can you highlight me or something like that? Pin, I think. Yes, pin.
Gabi, can we?
Yes, I can perfectly see you and your presentation, Kees.
Great. As we noticed, the last year's things changed, and I decided a couple of weeks ago that I'll try to do my presentations in a different way. It's about the many faces of regional identities. It fits quite nicely, I think, in this session. The last map which was shown was about regions in Europe. As a geographer, I'm of course very much interested in regions, and it's quite nicely because these are more or less the horizontal regions, the regions of cooperation within Europe. And what's interesting, that in the previous discussions was mostly about the vertical dimension, about the role of regional parliaments in relation to the national parliament and in relation to the European Union and the institutions. Well, my main point is the many faces, to show the different perspectives one can have while looking on regional identity. I'm from the Utrecht University. They sent me this T-shirt a couple of weeks ago. In the sense we had our birthday, and this is, I think, quite interesting, quite useful to show my perspective on identity. There, of course, you can talk about identities, about individual identities, about identification with regions, or you can talk about the identity of regions. So my focus is not so on how many people wear the t-shirt, but what's written on the t-shirt. My perspective, my discussion on regional identities are about the discourses which are used by regions, and of course that also has to do with identification. They have to receive that. Well, how are regional identities constructed, in my opinion? Well, first of all, they are a discourse in the sense that they are more than a narrative. They're a story about what the region is, but it positions the region. As a geographer, it positions itself in space, horizontally towards neighbors, and vertically towards other levels, towards the elements. And that identity discourse is then constructed through these different types, through this layering. First of all, there are some positive elements which can be uploaded to that identity. The region of Baden-Württemberg, some think that the Mercedes factories are important, so that you can use that to construct your identity discourse. But of course, there are others who have a different opinion about it. So it's also not only about uploading positive elements, but also about exclusion of bad elements. So that is the linkage with the sub-regional level. And then there's, of course, especially in Europe, there's a lot of cooperation, a lot of alignment between similar neighbors. That's the cooperation dimension. But that's, of course, also opposed. You associate your region with favoring other regions. Regions you find interesting, you find similar to you, but there's also the opposition, the othering to other spaces. Perhaps Bavaria is not so well received in some of regional identity discourses on Baden-Württemberg, but I'm just freestyling more or less. And then there's, of course, the downloading of positive elements from the above regional level, which is mostly the national or the European level. You can see yourself as one of the motors of Europe, and then you're really downloading those positive elements, or you're constructing your identity as towards to distance yourself from the higher level. Of course, many Catalans see themselves as a regional identity which is very much focused on the autonomy towards, or even the independence towards the Spanish state. So this is my vision on the regional identity discourses. They are not constructed in isolation, but they are constructed in relation to other regions, to other regions and other layers, the local level and the national European level. And that, of course, can change, and there can be many different visions on it. So, what types of regional identity discourses can one distinguish? In my opinion, there are thick and thin. They are more territorial, more relational, and one can underpin that from several ways. I just, in this presentation, I'll use one source. I'm currently in urban geography, and this is Jane Jacobs, a representation of Jane Jacobs, who died a couple of years ago, who is seen as a kind of sacred saint of urban geography, who focused on the diversity, the importance of diversity in cities, completely against the planning in the 1960s in America and also in the Netherlands, where everything was to be divided functionally in spaces. And her point was that diversity in central areas, where she lived, by the way, that is one of the motors of urban life and urban development. She also wrote another book, a book in the later years in life, Systems of Survival, which is about the moral backgrounds of these kind of processes. And she started out, and she thought, well, an important in social life is the trade mentality, the commercial ethics. That's about openness. It's about trusting each other. It's about individuality and other things. But then she did it through the analysis of many different sources. But she thought, well, that's not a complete picture. Of course, many others would agree. It's not only about trade, it's also about politics. So also the guardian dimension what was seen as an important moral system. So there's two systems. The one, the open, the territorial, let's say the horizontal dimension of how social life is organized, and the other one, more the vertical, the hierarchical, the territorial dimension. Well, this maps, I think, quite nicely on other sources when you talk about the distinction between different types of identities. There's a typology I created the first version like 10 years ago, and I'm currently writing a book, and I try to develop it a little bit more in a different way. Well, first of all, you have that territorial dimension, that vertical dimension, which is linked to ideas about community. The idea that the identity of the region in this case then is linked to the regional community. It's linked to livelihood, about distributing that everybody has a good life. It's about distribution. It's focused very much on the past, on the history, the historic roots. You could also, it's quite similar to the traditional views on the nation. Very much focused inwards on the relation within that territory, and this, which is very much rooted, it's linked to that, and it's very much focused on autonomy. It links a bit to one of the previous discussions about the idea of parochialism. Well, you can label that. It's about society and about space. It's about community. The ideas, the evaluation of change, and it's about the idea of how such region exists at a specific space, really completely bounded, and that is different from the relational or horizontal or thin perspective, which very much values individual actions. Also values relations. There's very much an outward focus, a commercial focus. Very much focus on not on the local level, on the parochial level, but on the global level, or at least European level. Very much focused on the future, and very much focused on individual freedom. So that gives a framework, a typology, to look a little bit further at, which is already my last, I was almost going to say slide, but which is a kind of heuristic topology types I developed in presentation in preparation for this small lecture, and it relates more to the European Union. I use a differentiation between the vertical dimension and the positive association, and more a negative association, and the horizontal dimension, also positive and negative, and then try to link that a bit to regional identities and Europe. Well, first of all, the first way of the relation between Europe and regions, that links up with the previous presentation. It's about protecting. It's clearly about the territorial dimension, about a clearly demarked region where you protect the established rights of the inhabitants, or in this case about the the indication of the region of origin, that's regulated by the European Union, and which protects the traditional regional economy for that, but also language rights. You can also link that up to that position, more or less. Then there's another possibility, which is much more not so much focused on well, I'm not sure if it really fits in this simple graph. It's very much more open, and one can argue that sees the European Union as the protector of regional identity against the nation state. So perhaps more in the mid position on the vertical dimension, and it's quite open. Here you see the flag, the Estrella, the Catalonian independence flag, combined with the European flag. So the idea that Catalonia can become independent because it's protected by Europe. I was a couple of years ago. There was in Amsterdam. Puigdemont had a session in, believe it or not, a theater when he was asked about his ideas. He is still a refugee, one of our few European refugees within Europe. And he was asked at the end, well, what do you think personally? What will be the solution to the problem, to your predicament of having to live as a refugee in Brussels? He said, well, Europe will come to our rescue. It is perhaps not the most common. It didn't happen, at least until now, I think. Another perspective is that Europe is seen as a threat to regional identities and to national identities. Which here you can see it, but I think it's a farmers' protest with the flag of the province of Friesland, which was taken like almost a year, 1.5 years ago, when the farmers protested against the rules about the nitrogen pollution, which trickled down from the European Union to the national level. And which they opposed. They opposed the national regulation in relation to the European regulation, and used that flag, that regional flag, as a marker of their independence, of being different. The European Union as a threat. But you can also ignore the European Union. This is just a map, a small map of the municipality where I live, which was amalgamated a couple of years ago, and it has an identity discourse which very much focused on the village identity, although in reality it's related on a north-south corridor in the Netherlands, and the Rhine axis going through it is one of the 10 corridors towards the Alpine regions, but it's completely ignored in the official identity discourse. So you can also ignore European Union. But to finalize, it's enough. And another 3 corners filled, and another convert is, of course, at a more sub-national level, horizontally, about cooperation. The Euro regions are, of course, very important, cross-border regions, which are against, which want autonomy and use, to some extent, like Catalonia, use the European Union for that autonomy, very much focused on relations with each other. So it should be perhaps a bit more to the right. But that is not really, that also has to do with identification. It's not only, this is the official discourse, but there's, of course, a lot of opposition against it. When you look at a map with an indication of populist parties, you see that the right-wing populism in the Netherlands is really concentrated, especially in that Euro region and at the other border regions. So there's a bifurcation taking place in relation of the identity of those regions in relation to Europe. So identity is also about, it can be different ideas about it. Lastly, to finalize my lecture, small lecture, I want to discuss a little bit about how that can change over time. I'm working on a book, and one of the things I research is it's about the positioning of the Amsterdam region. This is a sketch which is kind of an iconic sketch of the Randstad, the rim city, the concepts developed after the Second World War to control urbanization. And here, this blob is Amsterdam, which is then seen part of a larger urban core, which has to be controlled. The urbanization after the Second World War had to be controlled, the open area protected, and the whole territory of the Netherlands had to be protected against the over-concentration, the over-urbanization in the Netherlands. So that fits quite with the nationalistic hierarchical control, and relations are not so important. Europe didn't really matter that much. It was seen as an emerging territory, as an alternative to the nation state. In the 1990s, things changed. The traditional welfare state, the nation state, became in crisis, and also the idea of the Randstad changed. In the last nationally involved, this is a euro, so it's about competitiveness, it's about wealth, and that was the idea that by central government, so it's in this side of the graph, the idea that the Randstad should be strengthened, the urbanization should be promoted, infrastructure should be improved, not for the inhabitants, but for the economic competitiveness of that core region in the Netherlands. Since the 1990s, centralized planning has disappeared more or less in the Netherlands, but that resulted in a reformulation of the Amsterdam region, which this is one of their infographics that they used until recently, about the idea that this is the region, this is Amsterdam in the middle, and it's a cooperation area with extending arms all over the Netherlands. It was coined, it was an idea, came from planners and politicians in Amsterdam who thought that central control was diminishing, and they wanted to fill that political space by creating that idea that the Amsterdam metropolitan region was the core of the Netherlands, which it is to some extent, and they rebranded it. So they used the identity not of the Randstad, that old planning concept, but the identity of Amsterdam, with the openness, the cosmopolitanism. They use that to brand that region externally. And when you look at the first policy documents they use, well, they make a whole comparison with other European regions. So Europe is very important, not only as a space to compete in, but also where the competitors are. That has now changed, and it's become less open, more inward focused. This is a map which they now use. They now very much focus on the regional differentiation within the metropolitan region, and they want to even the territory. They want to deconcentrate from Amsterdam to the rest of the region on the one hand, and competitiveness has more or less disappeared from that identity discourse. It focuses now very much more on economic, circular economy, sustainability, but they still want to compete. They claim that they are or want to be the most circular economy of Europe. So that identity discourse, the one version, re-territorializes to some extent, but there's another, even flimsier, very thin, outward-looking identity discourse emerging, perhaps already a little bit disappearing, which is the idea that Amsterdam is in the middle of a huge Pearl River Delta type of region, which is sometimes called the three-state city, sometimes called the Delta Metropolis. And it's the idea that's also sponsored not so by the government, but by the main business association of the Netherlands, that should attract companies from China. They see Europe, but they don't see Amsterdam, and then they use this kind of identity which they promote to the outside world to attract foreign investments. It is on the other hand, you also want to say, well, we have to cooperate more, but I'm not sure if you put yourself as Amsterdam in the middle and you put Brussels and especially Cologne at the periphery of your region of cooperation, and you see that everything is concentrated on Amsterdam. I'm not sure if that's identity which is promoted for that region from Amsterdam, if that fits in with the other identity discourses perhaps the administrators in Cologne have. So I'm a bit running out of time, but that was my short exposition about the many phases of regional identity discourses and linked to many different regions, and try to link it up with the different visions and use of Europe in those identity discourses. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for this interesting presentation on the construction and types of regional identity discourses and the many phases of regional identities. And let me also add that this really was a very special presentation regarding its style and format that I personally liked very, very much. Thank you for that. And now we have our last presentation for this session. Stephanie Hatton will present on mobilizing citizens, but how, regional and local experiences. And she also has a presentation, I think, for us, or slides, was what I meant.
Hello to everybody. Hello to all friends of the European idea. And as you just mentioned, I think the variety of presentations which we have just seen shows what Europe is all about. United in diversity. I really liked what I just saw. Well, thanks for the invitation to this conference and the opportunity to introduce our citizens movement, Pulse of Europe, and our experiences which we made in the last 4.5 years of how to mobilize citizens, not only locally and regionally as the original topic of this presentation was, but also nationally and Europe-wide. Can I actually switch the slides, Tim, or would you have to do so?
No, I think I have to do so. I'm sorry.
Perfect. So anyhow, well, what was it about? Let's go back a couple of years in early 2017. Europe simply was not a topic, not as it is today. European policy was, and maybe still is, in a way out of touch with the European citizens. Many citizens worried about the future of the EU as anti-European parties and sentiment were gaining momentum. You may remember the Brexit has just taken place in mid-2016. Donald Trump has been elected President of the United States. Geert Wilders was gaining more and more power in the Netherlands. Marine Le Pen in France, the AfD in Germany, Cinque Stelle in Italy. That was the overall situation by then. And many people actually wondered whether they were alone in their concerns or not. I think that was also a very important aspect by then. So simply put it together in one sentence, the European idea was in concrete danger. Would you continue, Tim? So how did it all start with our movement? Actually, like-minded friends, I was one of them, felt that it was time for the silent majority to be heard. That was actually one rainy, foggy Sunday in November 2016. We decided that we would just show up in the so-called European Quarter in Frankfurt and ask friends, are you interested in the EU and would you want to join us in doing something? The something was still open. What would it be like? In January 2017, we actually founded Pulse of Europe formally. From there on, well, everything went really quickly. Just in about half a year, roughly 100 cities in 11 EU member states joined our movement. Here you can roughly get an idea. Of course, we always had and still have the most impact within Germany, but yet we have a significant number of POE cities also across Europe. Why did it work? I mean, that is why I was invited to speak to you here today, how to mobilize citizens. Well, very simply, we became active and we took to the streets. We invited everybody to join in. And I think one of the differences that we thought would be important here to stress was that we stood up for something. We stood up for the preservation and shaping of a united Europe, not against something. We more or less offered a frame and still do so, a frame meaning that we organized and organize easy to adopt events and actions. We very quickly got like 10 theses, which roughly describe what Pulse of Europe stands for. We have one trademark, Pulse of Europe, and whoever feels that he or she fits into these 10 theses and under this trademark is allowed to contribute. We always remained non-partisan. I think that was always important to us and to grow so quickly. And the idea was to promote a civil European civil society. I quickly want to introduce the three most important participation formats, which we offered, organized, developed in the past years. First, our public rallies, then our European election campaign in 2019, and later on our most recent project, the European Home Parliament. Well, that was how it all started. What you see here was a public rally in April 2017, right before the presidential elections in France. The message to our French neighbors being restons ensemble, restez avec nous, stay with us. Likewise, we had rallies ahead a couple of weeks before, Blijf bij ons, directed to our Dutch neighbors. And if you show us the next slide, Tim, likewise rally a couple of weeks later, at this time addressing to our friends from Italy, the aim being to stand up for a united Europe. There it was a Cinque Stelle by that time, threatening the idea of a united European Union. In 2018 then, we began to articulate the importance of voting for the future of Europe. The idea was to develop a European election campaign that again was non-partisan and most importantly inclusive. We had projects and formats designed so that both individuals and corporations could become active at, and that is important now, at the local, at the regional, and at the national level. The idea was get people voting, whatever you vote, vote Europe. Again, we did not support any particular party, but the idea was care about this important event and go voting. So what you see here are just now examples. A huge bank in Frankfurt, they gave us their advertising space for our campaign. On the next slide, you will see that we even made it into sports stadiums here at a big soccer event in April 2019. And then also we had something which allowed citizens, but also celebrities to join in. That was our campaign element, bringing Europe home. We had a selfie generator, which allowed to put in 3 lines. What is Europe about? Why do I feel that Europe is a home such as is my factual home, my local home? good old Udo Lindenberg supported us too. So the outcome, as you will certainly recall, was a significant increase in the voter turnout to a record of roughly 62% in Germany. Of course, not only because of our campaign, but I think campaigns like ours, they all supported this extremely important increase. I think we had over 50% in average in whole Europe, and certainly the next time we are being asked to vote for the European Parliament, we will again have to do similar efforts, because it is still a very important duty. Go voting for Europe. Here you see the Frankfurter Paulskirche. This was a light show which we were allowed to do the last day before the elections took place. So finally, this is our most recent participation project, the European Home Parliaments. What is it about? Well, actually, we want to organize political debates in a private setting. As I said, from the beginning, we felt that we have to go where the people are. These private settings ideally include 4 to 8 people. It is about discussing current political EU topics presented in a clear and concise manner. It is Pulse of Europe who organizes everything that you need to have such private debates. Bottom up instead of top down is extremely important from our point of view. Here again, everybody is invited. So it's not that you are being asked to contribute or that you are being elected to a certain forum, but everybody may join in. That is why we think that this citizens participation format is diverse. It is local or across borders. So wherever you are allowed to give your opinion on these political topics. The original idea was, of course, to come together in a real setting of offline, but as we just have now seen in the pandemic situation, this is not possible. So we also offer our home parliaments, of course, online. You can do this privately with whatever techniques you have, but Pulse of Europe also supports the possibility to do European home parliaments across borders online. We organize, and we think this is a kind of a very important aspect, we organize direct dialogues with key EU decision makers. The idea is that before we start a so-called European Home Parliaments round, we get in contact with EU political decision makers who subscribe to this event, and they promise that after the home parliaments have taken place, that they will comment on the debate results, that they will give a personal statement, what they think of the outcome, if they see a chance to include the results in their daily work. Last time in the third round, we had even Commission President Ursula von der Leyen supporting the European Home Parliaments. We had Manfred Weber, we had Katharina Barley, but we also had EU parliamentarians from other EU countries, and they all gave feedback via webinars, via personal statements, via video statements on what they thought about the third round. As you will see in a couple of minutes, the fourth round has just started. The idea behind this format is that citizens' opinions will be heard in Brussels even beyond the election. So it's not just about go voting one time all 5 years, but via this direct dialogue with political decision makers, your opinion is being heard and becomes a concrete impact on daily policy making in Brussels. On the next slide, you will see a typical setting of an online European Home Parliament. What you may also see here is it's across ages, it's across parties, it's across religion, it's across borders. I think that's where we have to end one day. It's not just about debating in your home country, it's all about debating across Europe. More information and certainly the possibility to sign up to participate in the European Home Parliaments is on our website at homeparliaments.eu. As I just said, we are just about to have our 4th round of European Parliaments. We started about 2 weeks ago, and this 4th round will still run through June 6th. The overall topic this time is how much Europe is needed in times of crisis. What does that mean? Well, we actually want to discuss what we may learn from the EU in the pandemic, as we have seen it in the last 1.5 years. We will discuss concrete aspects such as should vaccines and necessary medical products be produced entirely in the EU in the future in order to ensure the supply of the EU population, or should scarce medical products and medicines only be allowed to be exported from the EU once European citizens have been supplied. This round is offered in more than half of all EU member states and is available in 6 languages. Offered means that we offer it with concrete discussion materials designed to these states. We have already signing ups from these states, but of course everybody can join in, so it's not restricted to half of all EU member states, but there we have already concrete supporters and concrete participants. A matching process, which we have only recently introduced, allows to bring together people not only across countries and irrespective of age and social background and political views, but also if you have not yet a community or a group of people, you can just sign up and we will then match you with other interested people from wherever, and so you can have your own European Home Parliament. POE is of course also active in the digital world. Apart from our websites, we are very active on Facebook and Twitter, and we have a significant reach. But we think that the digital world may never substitute what it means to come together in person. And that is why, of course, we use the time of the pandemic to develop more possibilities, more digital means to stay in touch, but still we believe that it's really the personal interaction that is important and that should not be disregarded. The conference on the future of Europe, not a surprise, I suppose, of course, is also from our perspective a very important and very, let's say, interesting project, but I do not want to give the impression that we only see advantages about it. We are also a little bit concerned that if this is not going to be a real success, meaning that people will not really get the impression that they are being heard and that what they feel Europe should be about will become somehow reality. It's also a danger that by the end of the conference, we might not make 2 steps in front, but maybe also a step back. But let's see, we are of course engaged there too. We have our profile, all of our activities go into the conference, and yeah, we speak to many, many people in Brussels and wherever we feel we can support to this Europe-wide project. So to come back to the actual title of this short presentation, How to Mobilize Citizens, What Are Our Experiences? As I said from the very beginning, go where the people are, either on the streets or into their private environment. Offer low threshold formats. Rallies, of course, they work perfectly. They do not work as well anymore. Not only to the pandemic, but once in a while, rallies certainly are not enough. But other events open to the public, projects easy to join, such as our European home parliaments. I think this is a key to really get people mobilized and to get active. As we addressed a couple of times today already, accept and respect local and regional particularities. We grow so quickly because everybody was allowed to organize its own Pulse of Europe group at their city, in their country, and according to regional and local particularities. You know best what is needed to mobilize the people in your environment, in your neighborhood, in your region, and allow this freedom to bring in very, very different perspectives, still under the same umbrella, still under the same roof. Cope with language barriers. I think this is also still an obstacle we need to overcome if we really want to come together, to move together, to really yes, get closer on the European level. And finally, citizen mobilization is not a sprint, but it is a marathon. We were so successful in 2017. We were, we were discouraged a little bit in 2018 because it got so more difficult to really keep people staying active. Then in 2019, again, we had a big success with this European election campaign. Many people joining in. Last year, the pandemic, 2020, again, we were kind of, oh Lord, how long is this gonna work? But then again, the European home parliaments with thousands of people participating across Europe, so many European decision makers, European parliamentarians who tell us this is great and we want to join. So it's an up and down. You really need a lot of breath to get things really changing. So we have some concerns that we want to address even more in the future. How to reach those who are not yet interested. We have to get out of this blue bubble, out of the bubble of the people who are engaged anyways. And that is really difficult, but still really worth putting a lot of energy in. How to establish political dialogues and political participation as a standard for everybody, meaning that it cannot be that it's just, you know, rarely happening here and there, but political dialogues EU-wide need to be a self-understanding element of every, you know, meeting at a kitchen table, in the dining room, in the cafe, with friends, with neighbors. How to overcome ignorance and rejection. Of course, we have many friends supporting Pulse of Europe, but we have always been confronted with people who even threaten us. What do you do there? Are you crazy? And many more serious things. But still, it is really worth, yes, to try to overcome ignorance and rejection, and to really believe that it's worth doing what we started 5 years ago. And then again, language barriers. We haven't, of course, yet found a solution for us, but I think, like the European home parliaments, who are now offered in 7 languages, this cost us a lot of energy, a lot of money, which we actually do not really have. But still, we think, except that even English is not enough to really allow people to exchange ideas. Go to them, speak to them in their language, and still try to get in contact across countries, which then finally we hope will allow us to create a European identity, because that is the secret behind everything. You have to feel not only nationally, you can be German, French, Dutch, whatever. You have to be allowed to have your local identity, and yet besides, on top, in addition, you have to have this European identity if Europe really can work in the future. If you want to get an idea how it feels to be part of Pulse of Europe, you may watch this short video on YouTube, which gets which may be able to get you an idea of what it means to be part of us. And should you have any other ideas, questions, please feel free to contact us, or join in, become member of a European Home Parliament. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for this kind of different and activist kind of perspective that you provided us with. As we're running a bit out of time, I will hand over now to our discussant, which has the opportunity, but also the not so easy task to comment on this very, to some extent, also very different papers and presentations, but they also have something in common, which is the citizen-focused or the identity-focused aspects. And so we're very curious to hear about your comments. And then, as you can see, there are already a number of questions in the chat. And I would say that we collect these questions afterwards, and then so please take the opportunity to write your question in the chat now, so that we can collect them, and then give all the speakers the opportunity to wrap up their answers in one very brief statement. So now it's Katrin Böttger's turn. Please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you also to the organizers for the invitation. And I'm happy to see many familiar faces or familiar names in the list of participants. I thought that I had the easy job being the discussion and not having to put in a paper, but now I'm not so sure anymore. It's quite a diverse list of topics or a list of presentations, and very interesting, all of them. So I have a few comments on each of the papers or presentations, and then a few of them are also of a more general nature. First of all, I wanted to thank Anna for her presentation and for making quantitative studies digestible even for me as a more practically oriented policy researcher. So I think I got your points, which is good feedback. I also wanted to comment on the fact that you were frustrated about the lack of data on the regional level, which is something that I've been frustrated with for at least 20 years. So I'm a little bit disappointed that this has not improved in recent times. I was curious about one element of the way you structured your research, and this is the fact that you use the national GDP as the average basis rather than the EU GDP as the average basis for the regions. And the reason why I'm asking this is because I remember the studies on this so-called blue banana, where you have very strong regions of Europe that are more concentrated in Western Europe. And I believe that this has continued more than was expected throughout the time after the Eastern enlargement. And I was wondering if this does not or if you have considered that this may have an effect on how the outcome of your research would be, because if you chose the European GDP, you might have a situation where you have a lot of laggard regions in some countries and all of the kind of achieving regions in other countries. And by using the national GDP, you might be kind of averaging this out more than might be helpful for your results. From a kind of practical recommendations level, I was wondering whether I could read the results of your studies as you said which regions are less pro-European and are more Eurosceptic. So by turning this around, would you say that the regions that have a more average kind of economic outlook are more pro-European, and wouldn't this be an argument for increasing the cohesion within the European Union also? Turning to Emma's paper, I thought this was also a very interesting approach, also combining the different, let me just go back to my notes, the different kind of historic cleavages and also the different state systems. I don't know if I heard you correctly when you mentioned that in the federal state, that the culture is based on the regional level, because I think for Germany this is certainly the case. So this is something to consider in your studies. And from your paper, I read that one point or your argument for looking at the historic cleavages in multilingual regions was that they are still reflected in today's rhetoric, and this is something that I think this is something that I would agree with, definitely. But I would be interested to hear if you would be analyzing this more in detail within your PhD, how these are reflected in today's talks about regional identity. And this actually leads me to something that I found connected yours and Keith's presentation also, and that's the question of the historic development of this kind of reflection. Because one element that I think is also important to remember when involving the citizens is that we have many new young citizens that are becoming relevant for the European integration process and for the regions. Every election there are new voters and so on coming in, and I think it would be interesting to see how this kind of reflection changes over time for the last, let's say, 10 or 20 years, and in how far this kind of historic cleavage is factual, or it's something that is perceived or even kind of pillarized the longer this kind of historic period is in the past, and we have no people that still recognize or remember those times from their own experience. And this was something that I was also wondering when, because the examples that you mentioned in your presentation, Keith, and I also thought the paper was very interesting, but the presentation also, the way that you presented it was very, I think, helpful and visual for all of us. But here I was also, it was interesting, the examples that you brought from Germany, like Baden-Württemberg, which is a region that, I think now it's already established as one region, but if you ask older people there, they will certainly say that it's two regions, and it's definitely not one. But it may have changed through new identities. So this is something that would be interesting for me to hear also from your perspective. And I wanted to ask also, because you have so many kind of interesting levels. First of all, the typology of identities that you have, but then also the graph that you were showing. If you could just, for me, it would be helpful to hear again what these two different directions are supposed to signify. I understood that one is kind of stronger EU relevance and lower EU relevance, but from the vertical one, I was not 100% sure that I understood what the differentiation is and how these two relate. So that would be, I think, helpful. And I did look at the paper, and you use it there as well, but I think just from the presentation, that would be really helpful. On Stephanie's presentation, thank you also very much. I'm familiar with your work, but it's great to see kind of the view and also a little bit the reasoning behind it and the structuring of it. And I think that what you said, that the making the silent majority heard. I think this was really the key factor that made the movement so successful, and also perceived as very necessary, especially at that time, because a lot of the positive notions were not heard on the streets or in the news. And you mentioned that one of the elements was that you stood for something and not just against something, and I would agree. But I would also say that you found kind of a sweet spot of standing for something that was not too general, but also not too specific. So it was, people were able to rally behind it because it was something that was not too partisan also, because if you had become more specific and more partisan, I think it would have excluded groups, and that would have reduced kind of the support and the visibility that you also received. And in a way, this also means that the activities that you had for the European elections allowed for a kind of division of labor between parts of Europe and other actors and the different parties, because they didn't have to rally as much for people to vote. They could rally for their political positions, while others were rallying for going to vote. And I think this is an important step in making the European elections more relevant, because this means that there is actually party competition, but there's also a general pro-voting notion that is taking place. And here I also have a concrete question, actually, because we have the federal elections in Germany coming up, which also have a strong relevance for the European level. And I was wondering if you are including this in your planning of your activities in any way, or whether you are kind of collecting your powers for the next European election, which is also on the horizon already again. Yeah, so this was also referring to the fact that you said that it's not a sprint but a marathon. So it means that you have to reactivate the citizens again and again on different topics. I think that actually the virtual events also have an advantage, because it means you can have cross-border events with participants that don't have to travel anywhere, and they can meet virtually. But I think in terms of it not being a sprint but a marathon, I think this also has to keep in mind the younger generation. So there are always new voters coming in, there are younger people coming in that have a different kind of lifespan experience, that have no kind of first-hand experience of the time essentially when there was the Berlin Wall, for example, and they have to be included in this identity processes as well, because they increasingly make up more and more of the electorate also. I think I will leave it at that, and I thank you again for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you very much. As I said, I think we should collect now the questions that we already have, and then for you, the speakers, I would suggest that each of you then has finally another 2 minutes to comment on the comments that you've just heard on your paper, and also to respond to some of the questions. Of course, we will probably not be able to address all the aspects given the time limitations, but also for everybody to know, we will have the session a bit longer than we planned before. And we have already a couple of questions here. I would suggest that we take them in now. I mean, there is already some sort of a conversation between Elisabeth Donat and Anna Brigiewicz, so I suppose you already answered this question, but maybe you want to respond in your comment later. Is Elisabeth, okay, so that's fine with Elisabeth, thank you very much. Then there is a comment by Simona on the Lega. I think you can read that yourself. Then we have another question by Sarah Kikic. I don't know if you can unmute yourself. Please try, so if you can't, then I will read out the question.
I mean, I can read it out myself, or
Please do so.
I was just, it's a general question to everyone, especially with regards to the session's title, Bringing Citizen In. And in all the contributions, there was this notion, and as you fairly pointed out, regions being very diverse. What are actually your expectations on the conference on the future of Europe? As in this joint declaration, it says it wants to be a bottom-up exercise for citizens, and especially wanting to mirror Europe's diversity in its different panels, but I think in general also bringing in ideas from all across the EU. So in general, what what are your expectations in the sense on the conference?
Thank you, Sarah. Then we have another question by Paul Kindermann on the criteria for measuring success. Maybe you also want to pose that question yourself.
Well, I mean, Stefanie Hatton was so nice as to already pose one response in the chat. I mean, obviously my, let's say, direction of asking, of questioning is a bit provocative in the sense that it's probably a sort of a critical normative perspective at this point. But maybe I can just get back very quickly on your answer. I mean, when you talk, or I mean, obviously in my question, I sort of referenced this general and arguably rather generic critique that Pulse of Europe has not a clear political agenda, in the sense that the European idea or the European project is as such sort of a confirmation that this is too loose, this is too abstract of an idea to actually mobilize people on a political ground. But at the same time, you obviously presented a lot of very concrete activities, a variety of diverse activities. So it's sort of, I was basically wondering how you as a movement, so to speak, yourself deal with this development and the growth of a movement, while at the same time sort of having to balance this rather abstract notion of a European idea. Because, I mean, as opposed to, let's say, nationalist movements in the formation of nation states, it's a very different situation with such a supranational or transnational project like the EU. But I mean, we don't have to elaborate on that too much. I just maybe wanted to get back on this here.
Thank you, Paul. And then we have a final question by Gabriele Abels, which is also, I think, perfect to wrap up on this whole conference and not only on this session. Gabriele, maybe you want to pose your question yourself.
Yes, very briefly, it's following up on Sarah Kikic's question, actually, and it's based on your findings, academic findings, your empirical observation. If there is like a key lesson that you have for the conference on the future of Europe, what should they take into account based on your ideas and findings? Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriele. And I would suggest that we have your final remarks and comments in the same order as your presentations have been. So Anna, I would like to ask you to start, and please also try to keep it short. Maybe you have an opportunity later to discuss with some of the people that ask more detailed questions. Thank you.
Sure. And I guess I'll start by saying, how have I never heard about the blue banana, which I just Googled? And to just quickly answer Katrine's question, I do in the paper look at how the GDP in the region compares to the EU average. And I do find a statistically significant effect. It's positive, but it's not curvilinear. And so there is this interesting dynamic that like GDP at the regional versus the national level does have like a weird dynamic, but I can't figure out what it is just yet. And then, you know, I will say in terms of the broad question that was asked about like the conference for the future of Europe, as a public opinion person, I'm so intensely jaded about public opinion and what citizens have to say. And I'm just like shut down immediately. I think this is what Francesco was pointing at yesterday, that, you know, we talk about democracy, but do we really need more of it? But I will say that watching Stefanie's presentation, like my heart just swelled with happiness that there are thoughtful people that do have kind of good intentions and the intent to kind of inform EU citizens about the EU. And so I think I'll just end by saying like what I think bringing the citizens in, I guess, actually is important. You convinced me. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And now it's Emma Katharina's turn.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you also to Katrine for the comments and the positive feedback. I'm glad that the paper was of interest. To answer quickly your two questions, I will start with the federal state. Yeah, I mentioned, maybe it wasn't so clear, I'm sorry for that. I mentioned that the constituent states, so the German and Austrian Länder in this case, or the regional level, have the competencies in language and cultural aspects, yeah, and that these are written in the constitution. Meanwhile, in unitary states, you have to negotiate it on a case by case. So it's like which region is better at negotiating will get the more out of the autonomy. And in the second aspect about the cleavage lines and analyzing these in detail, I actually really do that, but only for the three first case studies. These are my main case studies in my PhD, because my focus is more about enabling the role of regions in bilateral cooperation. I go into detail, I analyze the national level legislation, and then I see how this national level legislation is confronted with the rhetoric, or if you can see, because of the historical cleavage lines, some aspects resulting in today's national legislation. And then I also go into the regional and local level, and I see how the praxis is, so the day-to-day life of these multilingual communities in these regions. So yeah, and to answer also shortly on the combined question of Zara and Gabriele, I think from my perspective and from what I'm researching, the most important lesson, which I hope will be not lost again in the Conference on the Future of Europe, as I said also that it was kind of lost with the Commissioner of Multilingualism. I think that was a lost chance, in my opinion, considering that afterwards the regions and the minorities, ethnic, linguistic, and so on really took on a bigger role in the European Union. I think the most important aspect is to really bring these experiences to discussion on a European level, and to really discuss the underlying issues of regional identities on the one side, but on the other side also to not forget maybe the Eastern regions, because I feel like they tend to kind of be in the background in the research. And I think that's also really important, because in the end they also belong to the European Union, and yeah, I think these would be two main important aspects for the conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Kees.
Well, thank you, Catherine, for your comments. I think you put a finger where the problem is. Those both dimensions. Well, basically, it's still work in progress, and I also got difficulty in fitting in the European Union on the vertical dimension. But perhaps the European Union is on both dimensions, or it's a separate dimension. I just use it as a heuristic device to make a little bit the diversity in regional identity discourses a bit more complex than just thick and thin, or horizontal or vertical, and also to include the positive and the negative aspects of identification. So not only identification with, but identification against. So that, I think, is a valid point, which I'm still work in progress. The other question, the general question, was about the conference, which I think you can also link to horizontal and vertical. I'm not sure if the same horizontal and vertical. But when you read and hear about that conference, it's very much about the individual citizens and the individual regions, and then towards the European level. So it's quite a hierarchy. What should be doing at that level or at other levels? Well, I think what Europe is about is more about the horizontal level. That's why the last presentation about the Pulse, the European home parliaments was so interesting. Europe is about cooperation between regions within Europe or between individuals within Europe. So I think those people who are cooperating with Europe, they should have a huge say in that conference on the future of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Stephanie.
Well, thanks. And I would quickly like to comment first on Paul's remarks. Yes, how to measure success. As I already wrote in the chat, for us, it's all about awareness. And it's awareness that the EU and the European idea is not self-evident, and we have to defend it constantly. In the beginning, of course, the success of Pulse of Europe was measured purely by quantity. 100,000 people on the same day, on a Sunday afternoon, on the streets with European flags in 2017. That was a huge success. But of course, you cannot permanently do this. I mean, even movements like Fridays for Future. Yeah, they have been so much bigger than ours, and still they are suffering a very similar development by now. So eventually you shift from quantity to quality, if you so want. And if we now have our European home parliaments, where we lately had a couple of thousands people participating, but very concretely talking to EU decision makers, to Manfred Weber, to Katharina Bali, to Lukuš Kohut, to Gwendolyn Delbas-Corfield, to Pedros Marquez, we had so across parties, across countries. This is very concrete and very specific, influencing political decision processes. This is also a success. To Katrin, yes, of course, there will be a campaign also in light of the German elections. It will probably not be as huge as the European election campaign, first because, of course, this was, I mean, our campaign by nature of Pulse of Europe, but still the German election has this big impact, this big European impact. And again, we will be there. We will keep up the awareness how important it is to go voting for the EU. So yes, you will hear and see from us. And you will be invited to join, as always.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all our speakers, and also, of course, to our discussant. It was a very interesting session. Thank you also to all the participants, and also for the very interesting questions. As we will have the closing remarks on this conference by Gabriele Abels right after the session, I will leave any more substantive remarks to her. But to close the session, I just want to quote from the outer space transmitter. Someone from, I suppose, some of the conference participants wrote on the website, or you can see in the website of the outer space transmitter, on the question, what does it mean to be a citizen of the EU? Sweet memories of free travel. And I think we have a very nice, we had a very nice digital conference, but I think we all agreed it would be nice to meet each other again in a physical, real life scenario. And I hope this will be possible soon in the future. Thank you very much for joining this session. And now, Gabriele, back to you.
Okay, yes, thank you very much. It's now my task, my privilege to come up with some concluding remarks. And of course, at the end of a 2-day very intense conference, it would be just completely impossible to come up with a real summary of findings. But I think this conference, from Takers to Shapers, Challenges for Regions in a Dynamic EU Polity, has really profited from a very fruitful discourse, a very intense and inspiring discourse, which was made possible, well, on the one hand, because of the participants, panelists, discussants, and participants from all ways of lives, and it's that we had academics and practitioners involved here, that we had academics from very different disciplines, or at least, well, from a range of disciplines, not only political scientists, and that we had more established academics, but also upcoming academics, the next generation here of academics, to have them involved with their ideas and their approaches. And we have participants and panelists from very different countries, bringing in a range of different perspectives. And I think that's been very important, very fruitful for our discussions. Then secondly, we have addressed quite a few different issues and aspects which relate to regions in the EU polity and to challenges. I'm not going to say that there is now a final answer to what was in the title, still the question from takers to shapers. There is certainly not a definite answer to that, neither if they actually regions become shapers, nor if they remain to be stakers, but it is ambivalence, and that we are still somewhere in an ongoing process. And so we talked a lot about regions, EU institutions in the polity, regional parliaments, regional governments, and finally the role of citizens, because the key claim that regions do make and why they call for a stronger voice, why they call for becoming shapers, is their claim that they are closer to the citizens. And so that is really at the basis, the foundation here. Certainly the Conference on the Future of Europe has been a cross-cutting issue, plus the pandemic, we cannot avoid that. And these will be continuing issues to be discussed in future conferences, and still certainly something to be for future research. That we as academics need to attend to, but definitely something which is a challenge for all the practitioners from different backgrounds, be it more political institutions, or as today from parts of Europe, from civil society organizations which are involved here. For all of us, this will be a continuing challenge, but it's also an interesting challenge, because it's, like I already said today, it's observing history in the making, and it's a chance not just to observe it, but to get involved here. And depending on your self-understanding of as an academic, getting involved might be an interesting option as well, and not just to remain in a distant position as observer here. So finally, it's my privilege to say thank you on behalf of the co-organizers also of this conference, the RegioPal project. It's been a great experience to do that jointly with you, not just in terms of organizing, but also in terms of co-writing a paper for the first time. That's been a great pleasure. And I would like to say thank you, of course, for the Arbeitskreis Europäische Integration, who's an important support structure here, also because they are always the ones in charge of getting the money organized from the Erasmus Plus program of the Commission. And of course, that's important to get some funding. Then I would like to say thank you, of course, to all speakers, panelists, discussants. Once more, a big thank you to Tim, my research assistant, who has been a great help in the last couple of weeks, organizing the conference, setting up everything, dealing with the challenges of a digital conference, and for Tim, who's a student of political science to become a teacher. It's been his first experiences with organizing an event like this, and I think he did really a fantastic job. And I think maybe at least a virtual applause also to Tim. Thanks so much. And finally, no conference works without an audience. I'm very happy about the many participants that we had who got involved in the discussions, who got hopefully inspired by our discussions about what they heard. And I'm happy to stay in touch at future conferences, or in the follow-up, of course, of this conference, and whatever might come out of that. So thank you very much, and of course, stay safe, and together we're gonna make it through these difficult times. There will be better times, I'm sure, in the future, but we make the best out of it. Thank you.